Now sports with sports director Scott Lever.
We haven't seen football played at the BMO Harris Bank Center in Rockford since the Rock River Raptors went dormant after their 2009 season. Tomorrow night, though, football returns to the BMO like never before. The Women's 7-on-7 Extreme League, or X-League, will make its debut here with the Chicago Blitz taking on the Seattle Thunder. The league's owner and chairman is the coach, Mike Ditka. The Blitz has two local players on it. The quarterback is former Rockford Lutheran and NIU point guard standout Stephanie Raymond Young. Guilford graduate Emma Vanderheiden plays safety.
These women are athletes. We got Olympic track qualifying runners, professional basketball players. Like, these women are no joke.
Very up-tempo, power hitting, just dominant women. We come to the field and we have one agenda, and that's to lay out the person in front of you.
At Guilford, Vanderheiden competed in soccer, volleyball, and cross country. She then competed in soccer in college at Upper Iowa. When that ended, she needed something to continue to feed her competitive drive.
After I graduated college, I kind of had like that athlete depression. You go from being a full-time student athlete and then to nothing instantly when you leave.
Raymond was a big-time scorer and playmaker at Lutheran and NIU. She also had a stint in the WNBA with the Chicago Sky. She threw 2 touchdown passes and ran for a third in the Blitz opening win against Kansas City. Her athleticism translates to any sport, but she says football, being the focal point as a quarterback, is far different than it was playing point guard.
It's a whole new ballgame. I stepped into this position knowing the risk that I'm taking, and I think that even just with the last game, I proved a lot of people wrong, and that I can actually play this position and play this new sport.
The X-League was supposed to get rolling in 2019, but COVID forced the league to hold off until this year with a limited schedule. Teams are only playing 2 regular season games and then the playoffs. This game between the Blitz and Seattle Saturday night is huge. Both teams won their opening games. The winner of this game is guaranteed a spot in the playoffs.
It's going to be the best game of the season. Yeah. Very, very competitive. Seattle has a lot of threats on their team.
And to have this game being played in their hometown makes it even more special for Raymond Young and Vanderheiden.
When they announced that our home game was in Rockford this year, it was kind of like an endorphin rush. I'm like, wow, all my family and friends can come.
I mean, obviously, I have a lot of ties to Rockford, with my family being here, with me, growing up here. I do look forward to keeping Rockford as our hometown.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right. Let's get this show on the road. How are you, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available, as you know by now, hopefully. The curious little podcast that is devoted to all things from the realm of what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. If this is your first time, pull up a chair, relax, enjoy, and take in the festivities. And if you're a return listener, well, we appreciate that too, for sure. Hopefully you're telling your friends and they'll tell 2 friends and so on and so on. It's football time again on this week's episode, and we're talking about the women's variety once more. As you may remember, we have done quite a few episodes talking about some of the professional exploits of women in the game of American football. Our pal Steve Guinan talking about the Toledo Troopers, one of the more memorable and perhaps most dominant franchises in this National Women's Football League that was around in the 1970s and early 1980s. Talked to our pal Olivia Kwan talking about the Houston Herricanes franchise. Our pals Frankie and Lindsay talking about the league itself in their book about the league's history. Again, in the 70s, 1980s, all those great episodes. Please search those up. You'll find those to be enormously interesting, even if you don't consider yourself a fan of women's sports or women playing football or any of that kind of stuff. It's fascinating stuff. But we're going to go a little bit more broadly this week to kind of get into sort of the overarching narrative of women and pro football with Dr. Russ Crawford this week. He, a professor of history at Ohio Northern University and the author of the new book from our pals at the University of Nebraska Press called Women's American Football, Breaking Barriers on and Off the Gridiron. And yeah, we'll talk about the NWFL for sure. We talk about the antecedents of that because women playing football both pro and semi and amateur versions, semi-pro and amateur versions, certainly occurred before the founding of this NWFL. We'll also talk about the status of the sport today by virtue of the two main, let's call them professional leagues in the United States, the Women's Football Alliance and the Women's National Football Conference. But of course, in between, we're going to be talking about what you kind of heard a little reference to there in our little setup clip, and that is this odd thing, but still very much alive, and part of this narrative, part of this history. It's now called the X League, but you may remember it from its original form when it came onto the scene back in 2009, called the Lingerie Football League. Yeah, and it was then relabeled and rechristened the Legends Football League. It is now in its third incarnation, known simply as the X League. No confusion there with the XFL on the men's side coming up in a couple of weeks as we record this. The same CEO and founder, Mitch Mortaza, and the clip that you just heard came from last summer. This was from the Rockford TV station WTVO, the ABC affiliate, Eyewitness News, and an interview with two of the players from the team known as the Chicago Blitz, not to be confused with the Chicago Bliss, from the original versions of the Lingerie and then Legends Football League. But the Chicago Blitz, Stephanie Raymond, you heard there, and Emma Vanderhayden, two of the players that, as far as we know, are still on the roster for the X League's Chicago Blitz. They were playing a game at that point. That was a clip from August of last year. They were playing it was a shortened season after having been off, if you will, for the various COVID years. And it wasn't a full season last year of the X League, which ironically was its debut or reincarnated year. It was a couple of regular season games, and then they went right to playoffs. And the Chicago Blitz not only won their game against Seattle in Rockford, as discussed in that clip, but they also went on to beat Seattle one more time in the semifinals, and then went on to win the championship, the Chicago Blitz. And again, the Chicago Blitz, not to be confused with the USFL version, for lest I digress. But this X League, formerly known as the Legends Football League, and formerly before that, the Lingerie Football League, is a necessary and oddly important part of this entirety of women's American football. And let's put it this way, the Lingerie Football League and the origins of this certainly was a curiosity, and not unlike the NWFL, as we've learned, the NWFL, back in the 70s and early 80s, the beginnings of which was more curiosity and, perhaps pandering, I guess, to the sort of the female form, shall we say, as well as women's ability to, quote unquote, play professional sports, in this case football, more seen as an exhibition, more as a curiosity. The NWFL, right? These games began as more like halftime entertainment things, and the Lingerie Football League was begotten from something called the Lingerie Bowl, which was for a couple of years a pay-per-view distraction from the Super Bowl's halftime show, perhaps kowtowing to more, shall we say, prurient interests. And make no mistake, that league is certainly in its early years, sort of the outfits, I guess you could call them, the uniforms, if you want to call them that, were certainly not unattractive, I guess. Neither were the players per se, but it certainly did the sport and women's play in the sport pretty much an injustice for sure. And I would argue that the X League, from what I've seen of it from last year, has very much evolved. There's clearly still a sexiness component to it, but it's also chock full of players that can literally play the game. And I don't think any player in the current X League, and certainly for the two outdoor leagues that exist today, would be confused with being in it for anything else but the love of the game. And that's certainly something that we've learned in our previous exploits in what used to be the National Women's Football League. The LFL, whichever version you want to remember, it was certainly, those are former versions. You may remember seeing them on MTV2 or on Fuse, various cable networks that most people don't even recognize that they even subscribe to anymore. But all part of this long and surprisingly persistent set of stories and leagues and continued pursuits in the realm of, let's call it, women's American football. Very much still alive. Granted, the X League is one odd sort of indoor-like version of it, but it's not odd in that the play is pretty good. It's pretty interesting. And certainly the outdoor leagues are thriving very much at the grassroots level, and perhaps maybe even at higher professional forms as we see success in other professional leagues for women. There are going to be 3, maybe even 4 volleyball pro leagues for women coming up. Obviously, the WNBA is a rousing and roaring and ongoing success. The National Women's Soccer League is doing quite well, thank you. Softball, very much alive. Lacrosse with various exploit, all kinds of stuff. Women's sports has never been in a better position. And we're going to talk about the football realms of that this week, both past and present, with our guest this week, Russ Crawford, talking about women's American football. And let's dispense with the promotion this week and talk to you about how to get this book. It is called, indeed, Women's American Football, Breaking Barriers on and Off the Gridiron. It is published by the University of Nebraska Press. And it is available as of November 1st of last year. So it's been out there for a little while. Now, wherever good books are found. And of course, we lovingly appreciate it when you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. And when you search up this episode, I think it's number 290, our episode with Russ Crawford, this here little show, you'll find a convenient link to the book. So by all means, click on that. And it'll be whisked away to Amazon, and you'll get either the Kindle version or the hardcover version, whichever you prefer. And we'll get a couple of nickels of referral love. We appreciate that very much. And I'm sure Russ will too, because it's another sale of the book. And it's really well done. And it's probably the most comprehensive review, if you will, of the surprising history of women playing American football. Again, both past and present. So by all means, click on over there. And we appreciate when you do so. And we also appreciate you sitting back and enjoying our conversation with Dr. Russ Crawford. Let's talk about women's American football, the Lingerie Football League, the Legends Football League. Let's talk about the National Women's Football League, endless stories there, as well as what's going on now, the Women's Football Alliance and the Women's National Football Conference, all of that stuff coming up. Here it is. Here's our chat that we had with Russ just it was actually a number of weeks back, just before the holidays. Please, as always, enjoy. So why don't you perhaps give our audience a bit of a sense of your adjunct to this story of, I guess, the longer arc of women's football in the United States, because it's not just this NWFL and a couple of the other topics we'll talk about. It's kind of been a thing for quite a long time. I'm really curious as to how you got interested in it and why I think the essential sort of overview of the game for women in the United States.
Yeah. Well, I got interested in it when I wrote a book on American football in France, also published with the University of Nebraska Press. It's Le Football, A History of American Football in France. And I came across the sparkles of Villeneuve-Saint-Georges in France. And it was a women's team, the first women's team there. And so I wrote about that in the book. And then in 2016, I was in France, and a buddy of mine and I went to watch the final game of the Challenge Feminine of the Fédération Française de Football Américain. And so we watched the Molosses d'Anières-sur-Seine play against the Argo Canes of Montpellier. And, it was very interesting, and so I decided to start researching women's football. And so, as opposed to the other two books that you mentioned, they focus in on the National Women's Football League and the Toledo Troopers, more precisely. I've tried to write an overall history of women playing football, mainly since the 70s, since Title IX. And so I go through the various leagues that have existed, the major leagues. I don't spend much time talking about some of the leagues with 6 or 8 teams that lasted a few years, but more or less the major leagues like the National Women's Football League, the Independent Women's Football League, the Women's Football Alliance, the Women's National Football Conference, etc.
So you must have been taken aback, perhaps, at the fact that the American game, football, was essentially so entrenched, or at least being played at a certain high level in France, of all places. I mean, was that a revelation to you, or did you have some inkling that this game was fairly well entrenched in other places, but perhaps not as publicized, or maybe on the amateur level, or whatnot?
No, I had no idea. My wife is French, and I think the first time I went to visit her before we were married in France, we were having dinner with one of her high school friends and her husband, and the husband, Jean-Marc Bircher, got up, went out of the room, and came back in wearing a football helmet. I thought, what? Where'd you get that? It's a souvenir of some sort. And it turns out he had played for a team in France, a couple of them, and was still playing. And so that's what sparked my interest in doing a book on football in France.
Interesting. And then, so this is actually dovetails very interestingly with the new expansion, I guess, efforts of the NFL to further colonize the sport in places like Europe and in Mexico and potentially other places, certainly Canada. And we've talked about lots of different fits and starts of that kind of stuff. But the fact that the women's game is also still has roots in these various places too speaks volumes that the sport goes far beyond maybe what we think in the United States is the end all and be all.
Yeah. In fact, in the interim between the National Women's Football League and the leagues that started around 2000, the German women had already started playing themselves. So European women were playing when there were no American women playing football.
Well, let's dial it back, right? The NWFL, I think, is having a moment years after its existence, right? With some of the books and the films and that kind of stuff, and I think there are probably some more stories to be unearthed too. I mean, the Dallas Bluebonnets and just all kinds of interesting things that I think you're right. And there's lots of sort of little bits and pieces of history stuff. But before we get to that, I guess I'd love to get a sense from you in your research. Give us sort of I guess a synopsis, maybe a really sort of a quick sort of understanding of sort of the rumblings of the women's game prior to this time in the late 60s, early 70s when, and we'll talk about Sid Friedman in a few minutes, kind of got the idea to maybe make it a bigger thing than it kind of was. Because I think what you're hinting at is it's been kind of a thing, either underground or at the grassroots, even beyond or before the late 60s to early 70s.
Well, a colleague from Britain, and here's a future podcast for you, Katie Taylor, is working on getting her dissertation on women playing football from 1896 to more or less Title IX in the 1970s published. And so she's unearthed all sorts of women who were playing football long before Sid Friedman came along, or Friedman came along. Alice Camp, I believe, the wife of Walter Camp, helped him coach. Let's see. I'm going to draw a blank here on one, the head coach of the University of Illinois team, back in the day before they canceled football. His wife helped him coach as well. And there were women, the Los Angeles Amazons, their YouTube videos of showing them playing in probably what was the Coliseum at the time, or back in the day in the 1950s. There have been powder puff games, including the first one in Cavour, South Dakota. And there were girls' teams and women's teams who oftentimes beat boys' teams in the early days. So women have been playing football since really 1896, when a bunch of probably drunk co-eds played a game in New York City, for about 10 minutes before the police halted it. So there have been women playing football since 1896 at least.
What's your perception of why the late 60s, early 70s to take a crack at kind of either professionalizing or certainly, I guess, elevating the spectacle, perhaps? And maybe it's sort of a loaded suggestion there as to why then and how the coalescence, I guess, of something more, shall we call it, professional came about.
Mm-hmm. Well, Friedman apparently thought he could make some money off of women playing football. There had been precedents in Ohio. I forgot to mention back in the 1920s, a couple of promoters in Toledo had formed a couple of women's football teams and had played sort of barnstorming exhibitions and were making pretty good money off of it until pressure from people like Lou Henry Hoover, who was Herbert Hoover's wife, the first lady, put pressure on them to stop because Hoover's wife, Lou Henry Hoover, believed they were exploiting women for money. And so there was some precedent that people would pay to see this, and Friedman apparently thought that was a good idea. It didn't seem like there was any groundswell of women saying we want to play football. I mean, there were examples here and there around the country, but Friedman's offer gave women who had grown up loving football the chance to go out there and play just like the guys.
So, but the genesis of his effort was, I think what you're sort of hinting at was sort of, I guess, sort of in retrospect, something a bit more exploitative, right? I mean, this women's professional football league, I think is what it was called, maybe highly in quotes, was an exhibition kind of thing, right? I mean, my understanding is that it was halftime sort of games played during, say, NFL games or trying to affix themselves to more traditional and or professional or collegiate men's games and stuff, and using this more as truly as an exhibition. But it seems like over time it went from curiosity and spectacle to something a little bit more, hey, maybe there's something a little bit more legit that could be sort of born from all of it.
Well, the exhibitions during NFL games, there was the the Frankford Peaches, who had played games in the 1930s, but that was only, I think, a one-off thing, and maybe another NFL team had an exhibition like that. But by the 1970s, Friedman didn't, I don't think, as far as I can remember, schedule any games with NFL teams or college teams. These were standalone events that he thought would draw in spectators, probably for the spectacle. But then people like the coach of the Toledo Troopers, bought into it and wanted to make this real football, and so it became.
The evolution, though, of it, right, with the pads and the sort of the hitting and all that kind of, I mean, literally this was women suiting up to play, if you will, the male version of the sport, right? There's no Were there any accommodations, really, or was this literally women stepping up to do the same thing as men were doing?
Yeah, pretty much the same thing in most of the cases. Even in the early powder puff games, uh, the high school girls wore the male equipment. I remember we had a powder puff game when I was in high school, and I loaned my uniform to one of the girls, and they played a game in full pads, usual rules. So it was pretty much normally equipped football games.
What was from your perspective? What do you think the attraction was to play and maybe even get a chance to play professionally? Now, again, we put that in quotes, right? $25 a game, or that kind of stuff, right? This is not a career move per se, but I'm curious as to what your sense of these women stepping up to play on the promise of playing, if you will, like a pro, as pros, motivation, and where from are these women kind of coming from?
All right. Well, in my research, I've talked to around 250 women who played the game, and most of them were like any other, well, even the ones outside of the country were like a lot of Americans. They grew up loving football. They played in backyard games. Some of them played in grade school or junior high, pee-wee football. And so when they saw a chance to play, tackle football and maybe even get paid for it, a lot of women jumped at that. The original teams, when they put an ad in the newspaper, got hundreds of women coming out and saying, we want to play.
And were there particular regions of the country where this was more of a intriguing proposition, perhaps, than, say, others? Right? Clearly, down south, if you will, or in Texas, right, where football is beyond religion, right? It seems like there was a greater propensity for teams and people to sort of join. But I got a sense that my sense is that as this pro game was sort of coming into being in the 70s, that wasn't necessarily universal across the country, or was it?
Well, Ohio, where football is maybe not quite as much of a religion as in Texas, but pretty close in certain parts of the state, has had 4 or 5 teams through about most of this professional football history, or the semi-professional football history. Texas has had their teams. There have been teams in California. It's spread pretty much all over the country. Even in Salt Lake City, which has a fairly small population, there are, I think, 3 women's semi-professional teams, and there's a girls all tackle football for grade school and high school ages. So, wherever somebody starts a team, it generally seems that they're going to find some women who are ready to play. They just, football is the most popular sport in America, and probably one of the things that gave impetus to the original Friedman idea was the new popularity of the Super Bowl, which started in, 67?
Certainly, and the NFL, not nearly the totemic, outsized sports juggernaut that it is today, but certainly was on its way as starting to stand out and become a thing, and the spectacle of the Super Bowl, and but also too, and you mentioned this before, maybe we should dig into this part now. You mentioned Title IX, right? So Title IX is not only in the background of this, but arguably maybe even in the foreground, right? This is Title IX gets passed and enacted in and around, I think, 1972, right? So right. That's interesting because that's around the time that I think the folks around Toledo and what was either the predecessor or the beginnings of, or the transition to the National Women's Football League. The timing of that is probably not by accident, these two things.
I don't know if it had that big of an impact. I think probably the Super Bowl and the growing popularity of the NFL probably had more to do with it. It took a while for Title IX to filter down and to really take root. In the early years, several young girls who wanted to play Pee Wee or sometimes high school football had to take their local school districts to court to force them to allow them to play. And so it took a while for Title IX to, to have an impact. Whereas, I think the money factor was what was, motivating Friedman most of all.
How would you characterize the quality of play, the types of players, and from your research, the games, the experiences, right? I mean, from what we've discussed and what I've read elsewhere too, not every franchise was a Toledo, right? But high school football fields, the equipment not necessarily being of the highest order, that kind of stuff, and maybe even the finances too, right?
Mm-hmm. So the quality of play varies widely. This is one of the debates that's held within the group of women who play football. Do we want to be a rec league team or a professional team? To focus on quality play. For those teams who have chosen to go the quality route, the Boston Renegades, the Texas Elite Spartans, the Utah Falcons, the quality of play is very good. And the games are, as good as you would see in many places. Now, the first two games I watched, the final of the Challenge Feminine, they had to cut the game a few minutes short. They called it off in the middle of the fourth quarter because the Argo Canes were running out of players. One of the difficulties that women face in playing tackle football is that most of them, find these teams in their 30s, and by the time you're 30, your body doesn't heal as quickly as it used to, and you don't tend to be in as good a shape as you were when you're a teenager. And so the first American game I saw was the Columbus Comets versus the Derby City Dynamite in Columbus. And I left at halftime because, right before halftime, one of the Derby City players got hurt rather severely, and we had to wait for an ambulance, and it was getting to be about 10 o'clock, and I was an hour away, so I took off. So on the low end, you see a lot of games with a lot of time taken for injuries because the women are not in as good a shape as they might have been in their teen years. But at the high end, you've got a bunch of players who are in great shape, in football shape, and who play very well. So it varies.
When it comes to the various teams of the NWFL and its sort of march towards professionalism and stuff, it's really interesting. And I'm wondering in your research if what your impediments were. I mean, obviously a lot has been written about, and even in documentary form, about the Toledo Troopers and arguably, or maybe not so arguably, perhaps the most dominant team. Although I think some of the hairs start to get split when you talk about when the NWFL started to, when its end date was. I think there's some debate. It certainly fractured into certain things as the 70s and the early 80s came about. And there were a whole bunch of teams that it doesn't seem to be until recently, right? Some of our previous conversations and books and your stuff too, that have really been, there's not a lot about them, right? So I mentioned a few that I'm just generally aware. I mean, the LA Dandelions and the Bluebonnets of Dallas and the Houston Hurricanes, HERR, and maybe in a most curious way, the Oklahoma City Dolls, when there was actually a made-for-TV movie about them or inspired by them on back in the late 70s. I want to say it wasn't Susan Anton. I'm trying to remember who was the star of that
Susan
film.
Blakely.
Susan Blakely. There you go. Got to get my blonde Susans together.
Just an awful movie.
Oh, well, there you go. But all the more reason to find it and watch it, right? But I mean, I guess my point is that there were little spurts of publicity, right? I'm sure publicity was part of the mix, right? I mean, how do you stand out? Lots of challenger leagues, a lot of sports innovation, a lot of women's sports movement beginning. It doesn't seem like the NWFL had a bunch of that, aside from a few exceptions, say like in Toledo. Did you find the same kind of thing? Was it hard to kind of dig in and find more information about these teams and the situations?
Well, it is hard to find information, especially in newspaper articles, because for a lot of these teams, they play in relative obscurity, anonymity even. That's starting to change a little bit, but for many of the teams, there's a newspaper article here, maybe one there, but there's not a whole lot about them, and that's one of the reasons I decided to write about this, because the same thing with American football in France. Some things like the Super Bowl or the AFL versus NFL or something like that have been done to death, and so I wanted to write about something that wasn't as well known.
So what do you, I mean, I think I kind of know the answer to this, but why do you think the league itself kind of dissipated? And I would call it dissipated versus folded, right? It seems like there was a lot of, I want to call it last gasps, but perhaps some diaspora, right? Where some branches off and stuff. I mean, in essence, it kind of was done by the end of the 80s. I'm just curious as to your collective thought as to why it did kind of peter out, and I guess more importantly, why in the decades afterwards, nothing really kind of congealed to that level again, aside from maybe amateur leagues and regional stuff.
Lack of money. And, as far as the attention goes, I think the teams, especially Toledo, Oklahoma City, etc., did get some good press at the time. A lot of it, of course, was look at the women trying to play football like the men, and the novelty of that, or almost the carnival sideshow type of thing. But lack of money was what did it in. And also, when you have a team like the Troopers, for instance, you have a core group of women who make it a success, and then over time, life happens to them. They get too old, and the injuries don't heal as fast, or they get injured badly, and so they retire. Some of them find other things to do in life, and so that core group dwindles. And the fact that there's no money in it means there's not much interest in new women coming along. And I think Gwynnon makes an interesting argument that Title IX actually hurt the NWFL, in that women who might have made good football players were instead going off to college to play basketball or softball or something else.
And maybe part of that is because there were more, let's call them professional or budding professional opportunities at the end of the tunnel, perhaps, maybe than, say, in tackle football. I mean, arguably you could say it's still kind of growing, right? But women, the WNBA has been around for 25 years, right? I mean, there's an example.
Yeah. And, the larger measure of success that WNBA has had is because the NBA bankrolled it. In women's football, these women are still paying to play football for the most part. They're paying to play football. And that amount varies from a few $100s to around $1,000 a year. So it's not an easy sport to play. You have to buy equipment. You have to stay in decent physical shape all year round. It's a way of life as much as it is a sport that you play.
Right, perhaps not unlike for lack of a better term, a niche sport, perhaps that maybe an immigrant perhaps brings with them and finds others who want to play with it. That could be a cricket, that could be a rugby, but yeah, all those things obviously getting their own professional roots too. But yeah, I mean, I guess after that, if you will, first major and at the time only attempt at a professional league, right? It soldiers on probably in either amateur or regional or semi-pro or other kinds of passionistas, I guess, right? Like-minded players that literally and figuratively play for the love of the game, and they'll recognize it's part of their overall life, not their only life, because there's no professionalism really to be had at the end of the day.
Right. So, yeah, that gap between the late 80s and 1999, the gap was there because there's just no money in it. And then a couple of other promoters came along, thought they could make money off women playing football, and the cycle started again. This time, more and more women decided to play across the country, and we started seeing the growth of leagues popping up like mushrooms after the rain and rising and falling with some rapidity. So again, the promoters thought there was money in it. Didn't turn out there was, but that's the impetus for the growth of the newer leagues.
All right. At the end, I'm going to want to pull the thread through, because obviously there's a lot of stuff that's going on now that maybe is a far greater garden of opportunity beyond what we're talking about now. But I cannot continue this conversation without this sort of next phase, and I think you know what's coming. And it's part of the history, for better or for worse. And to me, it's a monumental curiosity to me. But you can see sort of the modern version, hucksterism, I guess, of Sid Friedman in what was originally known as the Lingerie Football League, right?
Right.
And you title it, and I think it's because maybe the league itself is now trying to call itself the X League. But can you give us a little bit of a background into the origins of this, and then we can get into sort of, I guess, the what the hell it is or was. I think it's probably was as part of it. But for better or for worse, this was circa 2009-ish or so. This was the next attempt, really, at a, if you will, a quote unquote bright light professional attempt at women's football, but it clearly wasn't what it clearly wasn't NWFL style, was it?
No. And so that started off as the Lingerie Bowl. It was a competitor, I suppose, to the Puppy Bowl at halftime during the NFL game. Something to a pay-per-view event to watch during the halftime in the NFL, which usually takes about 2.5 years, it seems. And so then it ballooned into the Lingerie Football League, which then rebranded to the Legends Football League, and which is now the, as you say, X League. And I think it's still around. I'm not really sure. Mitch Mortaza, the man who created it, still is tweeting things about football, I've noticed. I'm not sure what's going on there, although Mike Ditka apparently is in charge of it now, or owns it.
The concept, though, was kind of an indoor variant of it, and their approach was, I don't know, explain, say, the play and the uniforms and stuff. I mean, for number one, indoor version of it, right?
It was exploitative.
Right.
Originally, it was models playing outdoors on a shortened field. Basically models. There were a few that had some athletic ability, but it was, looking good in lingerie. That was the main thing. And so after, I think, 4 years of that, Mortaza created the Lingerie Football League, and it was an indoor game. Generally, probably better athletes than the first years, but still in the uniforms that were, salacious, appealing to the prurient interest, as they like to say. And so women, again, got a chance to play football. And there's arguments about whether this is real football because it's played on a different field, different rules. Only women of a certain body type can play. and all those sorts of things. But the women themselves seem to believe they're playing football, and that's why I included a chapter in my book. And so it's gone through various evolutions. At one point, when I talked to a French woman who was playing for the Raphael Duche, who played for the Denver team, they had just gone to leggings instead of the bikini bottoms, and she liked that. But most of the women dislike the uniforms, or so they say, but they still want the chance to play football, and I suppose get noticed for other things.
Yeah, it's a weird hybrid, and it's also interesting too, watching it or trying to find how to watch it on television and stuff. It was tightly produced. In some cases, you could never really tell the way it was so tightly produced, whether they were truly playing indoors or outdoors. I know, they kind of alternated depending on the team or the franchise. That some of the games would be indoors, some of the games would be outdoors. You could never really sort of, I don't know. I could never. It's clear that it was hard to. You wanted to take it seriously because it seemed like there was some athletic competition going on. There were teams, in cities and franchises, so to speak. But then you also had to question it, right? Because it did seem to have some elements of, WWE in some respects. I don't know about storylines and stuff, but the uniforms and whatnot. It was kind of as a curiosity, as something to break through into the competitive sports landscape. It certainly garnered some kind of attention, but I'm not sure it garnered the attention that maybe Mitch and his crew wanted, or maybe it was, or was it something, right? Which is better than nothing, right? And maybe you're alluding to it with women wanting to play, and hey, if this is what it takes, it gives us a chance to play, we'll go for it. Well, what do you think? The answer is probably somewhere in between, right?
Yeah. Well, it was a major irritant for the women playing full kitted football because it became probably the most well-known version of women's football in the United States. I mean, it was on MTV at one point. It was one of the highest rated shows they had on MTV at the time, unscripted shows. And so women who played football in full uniforms, when they told people they played football, they said, "Oh, you're in the lingerie football league." And, quite rightly, that made them angry because, they played the regular version of football. But the athletes in the LFL, the level of play for the top teams was pretty decent. Let's see, what else? All right, I'm done with that.
Yeah, no, but and most were certainly certainly pleasing to the eye, which I get in terms of a product, if you will. But it did seem, from the little that I sort of understand of it, and some of the archival games that I've seen, or that there was definitely some athleticism there going on, and I think even some of the interviews and stuff. I mean, some of the coaches and the players, right, were taking this quite seriously, and arguably being able to flex their muscles, literally and figuratively, in playing whatever version of the game there was, right? But then, it's kind of, you pay the price, right? I'm sure the exploitative factor, certainly it played out as, in terms of it being taken seriously, which I think probably is the goal of all involved in some way, shape, or form. It's kind of this, almost goes back to Sid Friedman in some respects, right? It's, how do you bring women into a game that is historically male-dominated? How do you break through into the sports landscape? And then at the same time, how do you keep it legit so that it maintains some level of consciousness in the sports fan's mind and grow it? It seems like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't around this time. Maybe even now too still.
Probably so. During its time, the LFL, and whichever name it was playing under, was probably the most visible women's football because it was probably the most professionally produced. Games were on television at first, and then after that, they were readily available on YouTube through the LFL channel. They had great success in expanding the game. They had a season in Canada, a season in Australia. There was also plans to spread it to Europe. These international teams didn't last long because of resistance from women in those countries, not the women playing football, but other women. I suppose you could liken it back to Lou Henry Hoover taking the chance for playing football away from the women who were playing for those promoters in Toledo. So this gave women a chance to play football in a hybrid form, I suppose, but it still gave them a chance to play and I suppose attain a higher level of fame than their sisters wearing full uniforms. And of course that caused hard feelings on one side and probably both sides.
So we have this conversation in November of 2022, and it looks like the league is now rebranding or going to rebrand itself as the X League. It's interesting too because if you look at some of the promotional stuff around it and the website and all that kind of stuff, there does seem to be some elements of sort of the original, shall we say, sexiness of it. But it does also seem like it has their framing seems to be taking much more cues from, I guess, what's going on, frankly, in professional women's sports all around. And that's, I guess, sort of trying to flex some kind of muscle around legitimacy and athleticism. And like, this is a legit, real kind of thing, maybe belying its original roots. I got to think that's a good thing if that's true.
Well, it's hard to tell. And, most of the moves that they made, changing from lingerie football to Legends football to X League, have been aimed, I suppose, at gaining more legitimacy. Recently, the X League, on their board of advisors or something like that, have brought in Sam Gordon, who was a girl who became an internet sensation playing little pee-wee football against the boys, and then helped create the Utah Girls Football League. And so now she's a college student and apparently on their board of advisors or something like that. So yeah, they're probably trying to go more mainstream, although it's oddly become harder to find any games that they may be playing. I think they have played a season last year, but it's not as easy to find as it once was. Maybe it's going back to pay-per-view.
Well, all right, let's talk about some of the other things, though, and this will sort of be the final sort of thread that we pull through here, because the future of women and the sport of American gridiron football seems like it's almost renewing in terms of its possibilities again. And in particular, I look at, and maybe this is where the X League kind of gravitates to, or maybe there's some other challengers or entities that come in to perhaps fill in those gaps or take it to the promised land, if you will. And that's, you mentioned before dollars and money, right? The WNBA having the full faith and credit, if you will, of the NBA, and deficit spending with persistence for such a long time. The National Women's Soccer League, right? Not the first attempt to do a pro soccer league. I think it's actually the third real one. No help from MLS, but certainly is now growing in leaps and bounds. And all these other sports, too, finally, that are getting some attentiveness. The NFL is not ignorant of all this, right? And for other reasons, too, their own safety and survival, if you will. But it seems like this flag football thing has become quite a bit of a more than a dalliance for the NFL. And it seems that is where perhaps some of the heat might be gravitating around the women's game anew and timely because of, concussions and all that kind of stuff that the NFL arguably is going to, finally have to kind of grapple with on a more head-on basis, so to speak. It seems to me like there's some real activity and action where the women's game, quote unquote, could live and breathe anew, and maybe in a sort of a real active flag-ish kind of way, and maybe not the hard-hitting way that the NWFL had to do it back in the day.
That's true. The NFL is promoting flag football, and actually the Patriots have been out there supporting women's football. Robert Kraft has loaned the Patriots airplane to the Boston Renegades the last couple of years to travel to Canton for the Women's Football Alliance championship. And so there have also been women's games held during halftime of NFL games. That's starting up again. Let's see, the Utah Girls Football League actually played at the halftime of the Pro Bowl, I think last year, maybe 2 years ago. So women's football is definitely becoming more visible.
Collegiately too, right? The NAIA, I think, has some efforts to kind of make it more of a collegiate sport too.
Yeah, there's several teams that the NFL is partnered with the NAIA to have flag football teams, and so that sport is growing. There's still, flag football really took off for girls in Florida when the state athletics association there was wrestling with the problems of the numbers of male and female athletes under Title IX. And so they hit upon the idea of using flag football to boost the number of girl athletes, and it worked very well. And so when I've talked to girls who play flag football there and asked them, would you play tackle if you had the chance? They say, yes, we'd love it. So I think there's still going, the NFL seems to be going in the direction of flag football, but I think there's still going to be the market for playing tackle football because, most of the women I've talked to, and probably all of the women I've talked to have said, oh, I really like the hitting. I like crunching someone. It's like being able to perform legalized assault, one of them said. So there's always going to be that market for tackle football, but it does seem that flag is starting to become more popular, especially after the concussion crisis, 2016.
Oh yeah, and I think that's going to even be more so as more players retire and live longer, and with sadly with some of the results that take sometimes years to kind of manifest themselves, the pensions and all that kind of stuff. I mean, the career is already short for most NFL type players, with some exceptions, but it almost feels like there's some hybridization, perhaps, both on the men's side and the women's side. I mean, we're talking about flag football and the NFL putting bucks and interest behind it. But there are two, I think at least two, kind of, if you will, top tier tackle leagues for women: the Women's Professional Alliance and the Women's National Football Conference that kind of exist pretty exuberantly today. Maybe a little bit of a state of the state for those who are not following those leagues, and what you perhaps think the women's game will look like in the next 5 to 10 years. Where do you think it's going to kind of net out? Clearly, it's going to be something. I wonder what that something or some things are.
Yeah. Well, it seems to be getting a lot more attention than it has during the pandemic shutdowns. At one point, one of the only ways to watch football was through a documentary called Born to Play by Viridiana Lieberman about the Boston Renegades. That was on ESPN in prime time, which was a huge step. This recent Women's Football Alliance Championship, the top tier championship between the Boston Renegades and the Minnesota Vixen was on ESPN2 on live broadcast television. There's also talk about producing a scripted television series based around Black and Blue, Love, Sports, and the Art of Empowerment by Andra Douglas. There's talk of turning that into a scripted television series. You have 2 top-tier leagues that are starting to get a lot of sponsorship. When the Women's National Football Conference became a thing, they broke away from the Independent Women's Football League, and they started getting sponsorships from people like Adidas. The Women's Football Alliance has sponsorships from various corporations, plus the support of ESPN. Also, the Pro Football Hall of Fame must help them out because they're starting to hold their championship games at Tom Benson Hall of Fame Stadium. And of course, Robert Kraft loaning them the Patriots jets. So there is a lot of buzz around women's football, and a small buzz. And I say a small buzz because within the world, that's pretty cool. There are also all sorts of women who are beginning to coach at the NFL level and the college level. Sam Rappaport, who's an executive for the NFL, used to be with USA Football. And while she was there, she started the Women's World Football Games, which brought in women from all over the world to learn the finer points of American football. Then she moved on to the NFL and created the Women's Career Forum. And so more and more women are becoming executives in the NFL. And there are currently several who are coaching for various teams. Of course, the first was Dr. Jen Welder, who coached with the Arizona Cardinals. Let's see, Callie Brownson, who is a coach with the Cleveland Browns, also was the head coach of Team USA in this last summer's Women's World Championship, sponsored by the International Federation of American Football. And so more and more women are getting a place on the sideline in the boardroom. And so, yeah, it does seem that women's football is creating buzz. Now, probably the buzz is limited, and this is, a conversation that goes on forever with no conclusion, but it's probably limited because there are so many competing leagues. If there was one league with all the top teams in it, they might get as much attention, they might get on TV more. But since there is no overriding financial motivation to have only one league, you're going to have 2, sometimes 3, sometimes more leagues.
Well, it sounds like the opportunity to perhaps coalesce that does exist. I mean, if you think about it, as we record this show, right? I mean, literally coming out of COVID, there just seems to have been, there is still today, an explosion of investment in all kinds of sports stuff. I mean, everything from, we already have a merger of the 2 major pickleball associations, for God's sakes. I mean, Athletes Unlimited, right, which is a novel approach to women's sports and allowing sort of a packaged and televised environment that incentivizes for victories and stats and that kind of stuff across a whole bunch of sports like volleyball and softball and the like. And I think there's just more opportunities for women's sports. I mean, I don't think, many soccer fans would not have bet that the NWSL, the third major attempt for a women's league in that sport, would be as on the precipice of longstanding success as it is now. I guess my point is that dollars and streaming and investment opportunity, it seems like this one perhaps is ripe for it. I would even go to the stretch, although you're much more the expert than I, that maybe the flag variety could even dip its toe into co-ed and maybe make something unique out of that, not unlike the International Volleyball Association back in the 70s. And one of the 3 newly announced professional leagues in volleyball is going to try again a co-ed kind of structure. What do you think of any of that thought, if any?
Well, I think you're probably going to see more emphasis put on the flag football. Recently in Birmingham, Alabama, this last summer, the World Games had flag football as a sport for both men and women for the first time ever. And so, that garnered some attention, and probably one of the reasons for the International Federation of American Football was to make football, tackle football if possible, an Olympic sport. That's going to face some challenges because the United States is going to dominate that, and we have dominated that, at least in the women's side. In flag football, though, last year Mexico won the championship. They beat the United States in the final game, which was fairly unusual. But one of the problems with football doing what some of these other sports have done is that they don't have a feeder program, and that affects the level of play, at least for some of the smaller teams. So in other words, if you have professional softball teams, those women have been playing that since they were little girls. Same with basketball. But in football, you don't have very many places. In the United States, Utah is about the only place where they have a girls tackle football league. There used to be one in Indiana, but I think that's gone by the wayside. And there's always talk about starting more girls tackle football leagues, but they don't seem to come about. So,
yeah, I mean the flag variety may be the non-tackle variety, right? Call it flag or evolved, right? 'Cause it seems like it could be more, shall we say, accessible and maybe earlier on. And by the way, also at the same time, I mean, you talk to parents of boys, and maybe in historical football hotbeds, there's a real resistance to have their boys play football because of all the stuff, the concussion stuff and the injuries and all that relative to other sports. So it almost feels like to me like that we might be in a moment in time where some of the planets might be aligning correctly to maybe aid and abet women playing football, albeit in an evolved variety.
That could be. And flag is, I suppose, if you're into women's tackle football, flag is probably a challenge to that. Because, the NFL and the NAIA are offering scholarships in flag football, and so people are going to go where the money is. It might be a moment that was similar to Gwynon's argument about Title IX and the Toledo Troopers. It might drain support from women's tackle football, at least in the short run. I mean, when those women get out of college, if there's not a professional flag football league or something like that, they're probably still going to gravitate over to tackle football if they get the chance. But in the short term, that might pose as a challenge for women's tackle football. But I think that's still a popular thing to play because, the NFL's not playing flag football. So you're not watching flag football on Sunday. You want to go out there and, many women want to go out there and knock somebody down. So it's still going to be popular, I think.
I guess the question I would ask to the insiders would be, why should it be one or the other? And why couldn't it evolve into something that encompasses the benefits and the intrigue and the skill of both the quote-unquote tackle variety and the quote-unquote non-tackle variety, right? Especially if it perhaps becomes the legit path to scale, grassroots, earlier exposure and athleticism, and maybe even a vibrant sort of pro thing. And again, that could be co-ed, that could be women only, that could be some other kind of thing. But knowing the bigger forces of, I don't want to say that let's put it this way: the sport of tackle football is certainly under duress. It may not seem it when you look at the NFL and its popularity, but you look at where the talent is going to be coming from at earlier ages. There seems to be either a growing resistance or maybe a lure from other choices that might be safer or perceived as safer.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and participation in tackle football at the high school level for boys has declined, somewhat, probably 100,000 or a couple 100,000 over the last decade or so. But at that same time, participation by girls in tackle football at the high school level has pretty much, maybe hasn't doubled, but it's increased quite a bit. So as more and more boys are not playing football, more and more girls are, which is interesting. And I agree with you that, why not have any path you want to play football? And, it'd be nice if one of those paths led to some money. It seems like flag football is leading to college scholarships now, which is a good thing. But, it'd be nice if women could make a living playing tackle football as well.
Well, and that would be grist for your next book to take the next chapter of this story of the history. The good news is, right, it seems like there is absolutely more history to be written for women and the gridiron game. Yeah?
Yeah, there is. In fact, my next research project is expanding that story out to the rest of the world, because women are playing all over the world, even in Egypt and Morocco, countries where you wouldn't think women would play many sports at all, and not let alone football. But they play in most countries in Europe. They play in, Russia. It's all over Europe. It's starting to blossom in Latin America, both flag and tackle. And so there's still a story to be told about women playing internationally. And they're all over the place.
Fantastic. Really interesting stuff. I just continue to be intrigued by just how much history there has been and arguably will continue to be as women and pro football continue their sometimes inelegant but absolutely persistent dance with each other. And yes, the Women's Football Alliance and the Women's National Football Conference continue to percolate out there in football land outdoors. And from what we can tell, the X-League, the more indoor version, although I do know some of these franchises play some of their quote-unquote indoor version games outdoors as well, of the X-League coming back for a second year, as far as we know, is still going to happen. Let me see. I think we've got how many teams here? I think it's 8 teams looking for a more full season. Seattle Thunder, Denver Rush, Atlanta Empire, the Kansas City Force, the champion Chicago Blitz, Austin Sound, the Arizona Red Devils, and the LA Black Storm. So it's intriguing, and it feels like it's getting more legit, shall we say, by the year in this now third incarnation of that league. All kinds of fun stuff. And for the background and more intrigue and stories, the book is worth a get. It is called Women's American Football: Breaking Barriers on and Off the Gridiron. It is by our guest this week, Russ Crawford, the good doctor. He, a professor of American history, so he knows what he talks of. It is published by our pals at the University of Nebraska Press. It is available, all 408 pages of goodness of it, wherever good books are found, but of course on Amazon. And we appreciate it, perhaps, if you can go out of your way to do it. Go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this numbered episode 290 with Russ Crawford, and you'll find a convenient link to Amazon, and you will get it as quickly as humanly possible, either in hardcover or Kindle version. And thank you for doing so. We'll get a couple of pennies, nickels, maybe a dime or two of referral love when you do so. We thank you for that. We also thank you for following us on social media. We're on, we're on the Facebook at Good Seats Still Available. We're on the Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. We're on the Twitter still, believe it or not, at Good Seats Still. And let's see, email, of course, hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Our thanks tremendously to the wondrous gentleman that is Jerry Payne, he of Jerry Payne Audio Excellence in the suburbs of Atlanta. Thank you, kind sir, as always. And thank you all for listening. Until next week, we bid you a fond adieu.